It all started with something small, too small to seem important at the time. I noticed it during our annual family barbecue. Jake, my husband of 15 years, had always been friendly, maybe too friendly sometimes, but never in a way that set off any real alarms. But that day, something felt off. His laugh was a little too loud, his smile lingering a little too long when he spoke to Claire, my sister's daughter. Claire, with her effortless charm and that mischievous gleam in her eye, had always loved attention, but I never thought she'd aim for that kind of attention, from my husband, no less. At first, I brushed it off as a ridiculous thought. We were all gathered in the backyard. Claire was laughing, Jake was grilling steaks, and I was sipping my iced tea, surrounded by family chatter. Nothing seemed sinister in the golden light of the summer afternoon. But then, Claire walked over to Jake by the grill, and the way he turned to her, setting the tongs down as though she'd suddenly become the most interesting person in the world, made something twist inside me. It was subtle, a brief exchange that anyone else would have missed. But I caught it. That knowing glance, her hand brushing his shoulder, his slight, awkward shift as though suppressing something. I remember standing there, staring at them, trying to convince myself I was seeing shadows where there were none. After all, Claire was young, barely 24, and Jake wasn't some weak-willed man who would fall for someone just because she batted her eyelashes. I told myself I was imagining things. But that night, as I lay in bed beside him, my mind replayed every detail, every glance, and every gesture, until doubt bloomed into something I couldn't ignore. The next few weeks passed with that doubt gnawing at me like a splinter under my skin. Jake started working late more often, his explanations sounding practiced rather than natural. He wasn't sloppy, he was careful. But there were cracks in the facade, tiny inconsistencies that I clung to like breadcrumbs on a path I wasn't ready to walk yet. One night, when he came home smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't mine, I confronted him. Not directly, not yet. Asked about his day, all casual-like, testing the waters. He answered, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. And Claire? She'd gone radio silent. No calls, no texts, something that never happened. She was glued to her phone normally, posting pictures and sharing every detail of her life. But for weeks, silence. The pieces were there, scattered and incomplete, but I knew the truth was staring me in the face, waiting for me to piece it together. And I was going to find it. Whatever secret they thought they could keep from me, I wasn't going to sit back and wait for it to implode on its own. I wasn't calm. I was determined. The more I watched, the more their little slip-ups began to stack like kindling waiting for a spark. Jake thought he was being clever, deleting texts, keeping his phone face down on the table, and taking long calls out in the garage where he thought I wouldn't notice. But I did notice. When you've spent over a decade with someone, you pick up on every habit, every tell. He wasn't himself anymore. One night, I decided to test him. Nothing dramatic, just a simple question as we sat at the dinner table. Asked if he'd heard from Claire. His fork froze halfway to his mouth, and that second of hesitation told me everything I needed to know. He quickly covered it up, of course, saying something about how busy she'd been with her new job out of town. But that pause? It was all the confirmation I needed. I wasn't the type of woman who would cry quietly in a corner, pretending things would magically fix themselves. I wasn't about to play dumb, either. The anger simmered beneath my skin, but I forced myself to stay steady. I needed proof, not just suspicions, and I needed answers. The next morning, I waited until Jake left for work before grabbing his laptop. He was meticulous, but no one's perfect. The emails were clean. No obvious signs of anything incriminating. But when I checked his recent searches, I found something that made my stomach drop. A hotel booking for the previous month. A local place just a few miles away listed under his name. He hadn't mentioned a work trip. My hands shook as I stared at the screen. I could almost hear his voice, feeding me his usual excuses. It's for a client, or we had a corporate event. But the hotel wasn't the kind of place you booked for business. No, it was the kind of place people went when they wanted to avoid being seen. I drove to the hotel that afternoon, keeping my cool despite the whirlwind in my head. I didn't want to make a scene, not yet. The lobby was quiet, with the scent of lemon polish and cheap cologne lingering in the air. I approached the front desk and gave the receptionist my sweetest smile. "Hi, I'm looking for some information about a reservation my husband made last month." He must have forgotten the date. I slid her a piece of paper with Jake's name and the date I'd seen. She hesitated but finally leaned closer, lowering her voice. He checked in with a guest. "Did you catch her name?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. The woman hesitated again before whispering, "Claire?" My vision blurred for a second. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I'd been prepared, but hearing it confirmed felt like a punch to the gut. I managed to nod and thank her before walking out. Once I was back in the car, the anger hit me full force. I wasn't sad. I wasn't fragile. I was furious. Claire, the girl I'd practically helped raise. And Jake, the man who'd sworn to love me until the end of time. I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, as I asked myself the one question that mattered now: why? What was it about her that made him risk everything? What was he looking for that he thought I couldn't give him anymore? But I wasn't about to confront him empty-handed. No, this wasn't going to be a shouting match filled with denials and half-truths. I needed more than rage. I needed control. And I wasn't done digging yet. The drive home felt endless, though I reached the house faster than I realized. My thoughts were racing, but my actions were deliberate. I wasn't going to blow up without knowing everything. I'd waited this long. I could hold it together a little longer. When Jake walked through the door, he carried the same tired, casual energy he always did. He dropped his bag near the door, muttered something about a long day, and reached for the fridge. That normalcy, the audacity of it, was like gasoline on a fire. Instead of playing along, I stepped into his path and brought everything to the surface. Asked him where he'd really been last month. No preamble, no soft approach, just the truth laid bare between us like a ticking bomb. His reaction told me more than words ever could. There was a brief flicker of something in his eyes: fear, maybe. Guilt, definitely. He tried to deflect, mumbling denials that felt like a reflex rather than a defense. But it wasn't enough to deter me. I knew. He knew. There was nothing left to hide behind. When I mentioned the hotel and Claire's name, the color drained from his face. He was standing there, caught between the person he wanted to be and the choices he had actually made. He fumbled for an explanation, throwing out half-formed phrases about things not being what I thought. But the weight of the truth was crushing both of us. His story came out in pieces, rushed, fragmented, desperate. He spoke about Claire coming to him during a rough patch in her life, needing someone to listen. He claimed he never set out for it to happen, that it wasn't planned. But beneath the excuses was something else, an admission that he'd been searching for something he couldn't name. He described how he'd felt like he was fading, caught in the routine of our life, and how Claire's attention had reignited something in him. Hearing that was worse than any cliché confession could have been. It wasn't just about lust, it was about significance. He'd wanted to feel needed, admired. And somehow, he'd convinced himself that her admiration filled a void I supposedly couldn't. It wasn't an apology, though he tried to frame it as one. It wasn't an answer that I could accept. Instead, it felt like a justification, a weak attempt to make sense of a betrayal that had no justification. He admitted to regretting everything, to feeling like he'd thrown away the best part of his life. But regret, I knew, was just a cheap companion to guilt. He finally sat down, head in his hands, unraveling like a man who had lost his way and knew there was no map back. But I didn't feel like giving him comfort. I didn't care that he was drowning in his own shame. All I cared about was understanding how he could do this to me, to us, and what was going to happen next. One thing was certain: I wasn't about to let him control the narrative. If he thought regret was enough to fix the mess he'd made, he was sorely mistaken. I wasn't done yet. Not even close. The house felt heavy, like the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. Jake sat there, looking like a man who'd run out of places to hide. His regret hung in the air, thick and useless. I watched him crumble, but it didn't stir any sympathy in me. Not yet. I went over everything in my head: the quiet dinners, the subtle distance, The conversations that had once felt warm but had become rehearsed. He hadn't just betrayed me with an action. He'd chipped away at our life piece by piece. Claire wasn't the only betrayal. His excuses about feeling insignificant, trapped in the humdrum rhythm of life. It wasn't new. Men had sung that tired song for centuries, thinking it somehow justified their selfishness. I knew that if I let him, he'd spend the rest of his days trying to convince me that his self-pity was reason enough for me to understand. But understanding wasn't on my agenda. Instead of responding to a string of apologies, I got up and walked into the next room. Let him stew for a minute. I needed space to breathe. From the hallway, I caught sight of the wedding photo we'd taken all those years ago. Back then, we'd looked at each other like there was no one else in the world. Now that memory felt like an insult. Jake called out to me, something desperate in his tone, as if he couldn't bear the silence between us. He was used to me being steady, being the one who smoothed things over. But I wasn't playing that role anymore. I didn't respond. Instead, I went to the closet and pulled out a box, the one where I kept the old anniversary cards, love letters, the pieces of our life that had once meant everything. I brought the box into the living room and set it down in front of him. He looked confused, unsure of what I was doing. I could see the realization slowly dawning on him as he stared at the memories spread out before him, the promises he'd broken, the life he'd endangered for something so fleeting and hollow. I watched his face shift from confusion to something closer to horror. He was starting to understand that this wasn't just a fight, it was a reckoning. He tried to speak again, but I raised a hand. The silence that followed wasn't the kind of silence that begged for comfort. It was the kind that demanded truth. I didn't need him to tell me he was sorry again. I needed him to realize that I wasn't the one who was going to save him from the wreckage he'd created. If he wanted redemption, he'd have to fight for it. Not with empty words or desperate gestures, but with something real. But before I could say another word, his phone buzzed on the counter. The name flashing across the screen made my stomach drop again. It wasn't Claire this time. It was someone I didn't recognize, another piece of the puzzle I hadn't expected. The twist in my gut told me this was far from over. And whatever new secret had just surfaced, I was ready to face it head-on. The sound of the phone buzzing seemed louder than it should have been, cutting through the silence like a blade. I glanced at the screen again, making sure I wasn't imagining things. The name was unfamiliar, Lena. My pulse quickened as a dozen questions ran through my head. Another affair? A friend of Claire's? Or something else entirely? Jake lunged for the phone like a man trying to put out a fire, but I was faster. I grabbed it before he could and held it out of his reach. His face twisted into something between panic and exhaustion. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to stay hidden for long. He stood there, fists clenched at his sides, as though weighing his options. I could see him trying to decide if he should fight me for the phone or confess. I didn't give him a choice. With a few quick taps, I opened the message. It wasn't long, just a few words, but it sent a chill down my spine. We need to talk. I can't keep covering for you. Covering for him? My heart slammed in my chest as I tried to piece it together. I glanced up at Jake, who was watching me like a trapped animal. I stepped back, phone still in hand. Who's Lena? I asked, keeping my voice level despite the rage bubbling underneath. I didn't need to scream. I wanted him to feel the weight of the question. His shoulders sagged like a man who'd been asked to carry the world. She's Claire's friend, he muttered, barely meeting my eyes. I didn't react right away. I just let the words sit between us. And why is she covering for you? His breath caught, as if the truth had clawed its way up his throat. He looked away, running a hand through his hair in a helpless gesture. It wasn't supposed to go this far, he finally whispered. Those words felt like a slow-motion wreck. I could practically feel the walls closing in. I demanded he explain every single detail. He hesitated, still clinging to the hope that he could downplay this, but I wasn't having it. I pressed harder until the dam broke. Jake admitted that Claire had confided in Lena, who had apparently known about the affair from the start. But there was more. Lena wasn't just an innocent bystander. She'd helped cover up their meetings, giving them excuses and making sure no one in the family got suspicious. But now, Lena was done being part of it. The betrayal deepened in ways I hadn't expected. Claire's betrayal was devastating enough, but knowing someone else had been actively helping them lie to me, it felt like I'd been surrounded by snakes without even realizing it. Jake sat down heavily, like he couldn't hold himself up anymore. I thought if I could just stop, if I could fix things before it all came crashing down. His voice trailed off, full of regret that came far too late. I stared at him, unblinking. He had built an entire web of lies around himself, and now it was unraveling thread by thread. He wasn't just sorry, he was terrified. Terrified of losing me, terrified of what came next. But I wasn't afraid anymore. The truth was ugly, but at least it was finally out in the open. And now that I had it, I was more determined than ever to decide how this story would end. On my terms, not his. I stood there, phone still in my hand, the pieces falling into place faster than I could process them. Jake was a coward, but Lena, that was something else entirely. Claire's betrayal was personal. Jake's actions were gut-wrenching, but Lena? She had no stake in this other than helping them lie. She'd willingly become the enabler, the one who made their betrayal smoother, more coordinated. I knew I wasn't going to let that go. Jake mumbled something about trying to fix things, about how he thought it would never get out of hand if Lena stayed involved. The logic made me sick. How delusional did he have to be to think an accomplice would make this mess easier to contain? Without saying a word, I picked up my own phone and dialed Lena's number. Jake's eyes widened as he realized what I was doing. He practically lunged toward me, begging me to stop. But I wasn't about to let Lena hide behind her texts and silence anymore. The line rang twice before she picked up. Hello. Her voice was cautious, wary. She must have seen Jake's number pop up before mine. For a moment, I let the silence sit there, thick and uncomfortable. Then I spoke, calm and steady. It's me. There was a sharp intake of breath on her end. She knew who I was without needing a name. I know everything, I said, cutting straight to the point. You've been covering for them. You knew. And now you're done with it, huh? She started to sputter out some excuse, something about trying to protect me, trying to avoid more pain, but her words rang hollow. I wasn't in the mood for lies wrapped up in sympathy. You didn't protect me, I interrupted, my voice ice-cold.
You protected them.
You gave them the space to tear my life apart and made sure they had a safety net while doing it. The silence that followed felt satisfying. Lena didn't have a script for this moment. Finally, she admitted the truth, not because she was brave, but because there was nowhere left to run. She confessed that Claire had pulled her into this mess, claiming she needed a friend who wouldn't judge her. At first, Lena said she thought it was just emotional, something fleeting. But by the time she realized how deep Claire and Jake were, it was too late. She felt trapped between loyalty and disgust. Her guilt wasn't my concern. I don't care how guilty you feel now, I said. I care about the fact that you stood by and let them destroy everything. Lena's voice cracked as she begged me to believe she'd tried to pull Claire away from Jake, that she'd told her to stop before everything blew up. But all I could hear was someone who watched a fire burn and only tried to put it out when the flames touched her feet. I ended the call without another word. No yelling, no dramatic finish, just a click of finality. When I turned back to Jake, he was pale, as if watching me stand up to Lena had cemented the reality of what he'd done. There was no hiding now, no spinning stories about bad decisions and fleeting moments of weakness. You didn't just hurt me, I said, locking eyes with him. You let this whole web of lies pull in people who had no right to be part of our life. He nodded, though it looked like it took every ounce of strength he had. He was breaking, but I didn't feel satisfaction, not the way I thought I would. I wasn't fighting for his destruction. I was fighting for the truth, and now that I had it, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I wasn't going to let his shame and regret define my next steps. Whatever came next, I would be the one deciding how this ended. Not him, not Claire, and certainly not Lena. After hanging up, I stood there, letting the weight of the conversation settle. Lena's excuses had only deepened my resolve. She'd been a puppet in a show she chose to participate in, and Jake. Well, Jake had been the lead actor. But the curtain was coming down, and I wasn't about to stand in the audience, helpless. Jake was still sitting there, watching me like a man who knew his sentence was about to be read. He started to speak, probably to beg or spin some new thread of self-pity, but I held up my hand. I didn't need more apologies or explanations. The time for that had passed. Instead, I told him exactly how things were going to go. I wasn't leaving my home. I wasn't uprooting my life to spare him the discomfort of living with what he'd done. If he wanted to salvage even a shred of respect, he was going to have to face the consequences head-on. He looked stunned, like he'd expected me to scream, threaten divorce, or storm out. But I wasn't giving him the satisfaction of making this simple or predictable. I told him he could sleep in the guest room until I decided what came next. He didn't argue. He didn't dare. That night, the house felt eerily calm. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. I knew I wasn't done yet. Claire wasn't off the hook, and neither was Lena. They'd all played their roles, and I wasn't going to let them walk away as if this was some cautionary tale where the wife becomes a victim and life goes on for everyone else. The next morning, I sent a message to Claire, short, direct. I told her I wanted to meet. No context, no pleasantries. She responded quickly, clearly nervous, but she agreed. I chose a coffee shop away from familiar places, neutral ground where no one would recognize us. When I walked in and spotted her sitting there, looking younger and smaller than I remembered, I felt a strange mix of anger and something else, something I hadn't expected. Maybe pity, maybe disgust, maybe both. She tried to smile when she saw me, but it faltered as I sat across from her. There were no hugs, no greetings. I went straight to the point. I told her I knew everything, that the lies were out in the open. Her face crumbled. She didn't even try to deny it. She confessed that it had started with admiration, then spiraled into something she couldn't control. She said Jake had been kind to her when she was at her lowest, and that she hadn't meant for it to go as far as it did. But none of that mattered to me. The why wasn't important anymore. The truth was out, and it had left a scar too deep to heal with excuses. I told her I wasn't there for an apology. I wasn't there to fix her or help her redeem herself. I was there to make her face what she'd done and understand that there was no version of this where she came out unscathed. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't flinch. I told her I was done letting her play the helpless girl who didn't know better. She wasn't innocent. She'd made her choices. And now, just like Jake, she was going to live with the fallout. When I walked out of that coffee shop, I felt lighter, not because I'd forgiven her, but because I'd taken back the narrative. Claire wasn't some tragic character in my story anymore. She was just a chapter one was closing. As I drove home, I knew the hardest part was still ahead. Jake was in my life, whether I wanted him there or not, for now. But this time, I was calling the shots. And they'd all know exactly who they were dealing with. When I got home, the air felt different, charged, like the storm had passed, but there was still debris everywhere. Jake was sitting at the kitchen table, eyes hollow, coffee untouched. He must have known where I'd gone, and judging by the defeated slump of his shoulders, he'd been bracing himself for what would come next. I sat across from him, calm but resolute. This wasn't going to be another argument, and it wasn't going to be closure wrapped up in a neat bow. I didn't need that. I needed him to understand what his actions had truly cost him. I told him everything, that I had met with Claire, that I didn't need her apologies any more than I needed his. I watched his face as I spoke, how his jaw tightened when I mentioned Claire's tears, how he winced at every truth laid bare. But none of that changed what had already happened. For a long moment, he just sat there, staring at the table as if the weight of my words had finally broken something inside him. And maybe it had. He started to speak, to ask if there was any chance to rebuild, but I stopped him with a single look. Rebuilding isn't something you get to decide, I told him. You broke it. If there's any rebuilding to be done, it's on my terms. He nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. There was a difference. He finally understood that there was no reset button, no way to undo the damage with promises and remorse. The life we'd had was gone, and whatever came next depended on me, not him. The next few weeks were quiet, almost surreal. Jake kept his distance, respecting the boundaries I'd laid out. There were no more pleading looks, no pathetic attempts to rewrite history. He was finally doing what he should have done from the start, facing the reality of what he destroyed. As for Claire, I made it clear she wasn't welcome in my life anymore. Her attempts to reconcile, messages filled with regret and empty hopes, went unanswered. She'd made her choices, and now she'd live with them. Lena, too, tried to reach out, but she was just another casualty of the mess she'd helped create. I didn't need explanations or attempts at redemption. I needed space to rebuild something that didn't feel like it was built on lies. And slowly, I began to rebuild, not with Jake at the center, but with myself. I made changes that felt empowering, reclaiming the life I'd put on hold for too long. I started spending time with people who reminded me of my own worth, focused on goals I'd shelved in the name of being a good wife. Jake stayed in the guest room, still holding out hope that I'd let him back in. But it wasn't about him anymore, it was about me. Whether or not he remained in my life was a choice I'd take my time making. The story wasn't neat or simple, and there wasn't a perfect resolution where everything fell into place. But I didn't need a perfect ending. I needed to remember that this was my life, and I was the one writing the next chapter. And in that moment, I finally felt free, not because I'd moved on completely, but because I finally understood that his betrayal wasn't the end of my story. It was just the end of his role in it.